Hello, I'm your pilot April Snell, flight number 103.1 FM. This semester on Air International, we will be looking through the lens of peace builder John Paul Lederach and how he uses narrative agency, discourse, conflict, storytelling, and folklore as a means for transformative peace. Today, we have Professor Jeremy Rinker of UNCG's Peace and Conflict Studies Department. He will be discussing a collaborative effort between UNCG's Peace and Conflict Studies Department, the International Program Center, and Guilford Community College in regards to an experiential summer study abroad program to Sicum, India. He also will be discussing narrative agency, Antifa, and neo-nationalism. Stay tuned. Good afternoon, and thank you for flying Air International, flight number 103.1 FM. It's a place where you're sure to fly first class every time you fly. Ask me why it's first class. It's the passengers who make it first class. Today, we have with us Professor Jeremy Rinker. He's a Peace and Conflict Studies professor here at UNCG. Jeremy, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
He's involved in a myriad of activities to include, he's a professor who teaches the foundations of peace and conflict in the undergrad school. He teaches in grad school research in the partition of India. He has an experiential trip going to Sikkim this summer. So he's involved in many, many things. He's involved in the landlord-tenant mediation. He's involved with the Counter Stories Project. He shares those activities with his classes. Jeremy, so we said we were going to start from the global to the local. Tell us a little bit about you. What had you do your research in the partition of India? And we can just go from the global to the local.
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Where to begin, starting from global to local? Let me just start. I won't go all the way back to my birth, don't worry. I'll start with my Ph.D. program, the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And while there, I decided to re-engage with some work that I was interested in, kind of learning through Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a former a Dalit, a former untouchable, who had become the first law minister of India and has a fascinating story for your listeners. They should look up Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I was interested in his work and some of his writings, and while I was at ICAR, decided to pursue that research. So it wasn't initially partition that I got interested in, but it was really more issues of marginalization. People who were on the bottom of the Indian caste system, oftentimes called Dalits or broken people, and that group of people became of interest to me, and particularly their relationship with Ambedkar and his conversion to Buddhism.
You've taken us from the global. Now, can you take us to the local and what you're doing here locally and how you are getting your students interested in relative peace and going out into the community to make this world a better place?
Yeah, so I see all my work as connected, kind of. I might even say that the global to local frame is even off in some sense, that we oftentimes in the field of peace and conflict studies or in social movement theory or in other places of the academy talk about global, right? So when people are doing work on globalization, they oftentimes use this term global, that the global is the local, that the two words have been meshed together in some way. And so the work that I started doing with Dalits in India has certainly translated back to work here in the community. I've been doing some work since coming to UNCG about 3 years ago. I've been engaged as a research fellow with the Center for New North Carolinians. I've done some work with other faculty in this school, in the School of Nutrition, in the Department of Nutrition, in public health, other places, through the research fellows of the CNNC. And I've been reaching out to the Bhutanese community here in Greensboro and doing work around issues of trauma and resilience. And really that work has come out of interests that were spawned while I was overseas studying Dalit communities, trying to understand human rights and understand the kind of legacy of collective violence that both the partition of India created, but even prior to partition, the long centuries, millennia of caste oppression and what that kind of creates in people's minds and experiences. And so I've been kind of from the start thinking about these issues and the connection between trauma and resilience. And so I see that the work I was doing in India has lots of ways that it connects with our community here in the Triad.
We both are interested in the trauma that happens to people in war-torn countries, especially as it relates to post-traumatic stress disorder. And can you tell my listeners more about how you use meditation, or what some like to call it the practice of mindfulness, and how you use that with your students and with the people that you come in contact with, maybe the people that you come in contact with at the Bhutanese community?
Yeah, so I don't know that I necessarily have used the Buddhist mindfulness as much in research practice as I have in pedagogy and teaching practice. And some of that does come through learning from research subjects, not just being a person who extracts information from a community, but kind of works with a community and does community-based participatory action research. You're always learning from them as much as they're learning from you. So certainly my dissertation was focused on a group in India that is a conversion from Hinduism to Buddhism as a way to get out of the caste system, and followers of Dr. Ambedkar. And that group in particular considers themselves a Buddhist organization. And so oftentimes they're talking of practice and praxis in ways that a Buddhist would talk about practice and praxis, not necessarily in the way that a conflict resolution or conflict transformation professional would talk of practice. When we talk of practice in the field of peace and conflict studies, we're oftentimes focused on interventions in terms of mediation, facilitation, and dialogue, narrative agency, things like that. When Buddhists are talking about practice, they're talking about the practice of the philosophy of their lives, right? The work of not just meditation and sitting in silence, but actually how do you put that meditation practice into the work of your daily life? How do you get up in the morning and live the kind of Buddhist lifestyle, right? So right livelihood. How do you entail the Eightfold Path within the Buddhist tradition? And so that idea of practice, I think in a lot of ways connects with the ideas of practice in the field of peace and conflict studies. So oftentimes in classes, I will train students in basic mindfulness techniques by starting off a class with a minute or 2 minutes, maybe even as much as 3 minutes of the class engaged in doing mindfulness practice. I see it as a way to kind of separate the craziness of life outside the classroom and kind of seeing the classroom as a sacred space where you come into and change your perspective, change your mind, and work towards something. And so moving students outside of their daily existence and letting them slow things down, which is I think what meditation practice does. I think it's actually what mediation practice often does too, is slow things down. So when somebody's facilitating a conversation or mediating a conversation, they're often engaged in trying to kind of slow the process down and allow parties to hear and give voice to their concerns and to their needs and wants. And so that's, I think, very similar on an internal level what people are doing in a meditation focus. Meditation, of course, those two things are interconnected, and also easy to mix up those two words because they're so closely connected in the English language. Yeah, I mean, I see that again, I see all my work as kind of interconnected in that way. And I think that there's a great need for us to think about how we exhibit inner peace, and then how do we move that beyond inner peace to outer peace? How do we create peaceful structures and peaceful systems and peaceful existence? And a lot of that has to do with modeling, right? How you model behavior is kind of picked up on by people. The kind of people are intuitive. They pick up on the kind of emotional resonance of things, and so modeling a particular mindset, a particular way of doing things, I think is one important kind of peace modality, if you will, or peace practice that I try to develop in everything that I do.
Yeah, if I had my druthers, everyone who comes into UNCG would be taking a peace and conflict studies course, and to get a taste of what mindfulness is about. So I think that is a good place for us to go into when teaching the foundations of peace and conflict studies. What does that entail? We think of peace and conflict studies to encompass anthropology, politics. Help me out, Jeremy.
Yeah, so I think it's interdisciplinary. I mean, you started to hit on its best practices from anthropology, sociology, political science, social psychology, all of these things coming together and us taking the best practices. So when I'm teaching the Foundations of Peace and Conflict Studies class, either at the undergraduate or the graduate level, I'm continually kind of trying to get across to students that theory is important. Now, when students hear theory, I think they get scared, like they think that somehow that's something above them, that's something that academics do and that normal people don't do. But the reality is we're all theorists in the social context. We're always theorizing about everything that we do in our daily lives. And so I think the Foundations of Peace and Conflict Studies course, the way I teach it at least, is to really very much focus on what are the theories, what do we know about peace and conflict studies? What do we know about peaceful situations? What do we know about conflict? And how do we move conflict from destructive to constructive? Because conflict is good, but destructive conflict, of course, is not good.
Okay, last week we were having a discussion about what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, and what happened with Antifa and what's happening to peaceful demonstrations. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as it relates to peace and conflict?
So that's a broad question, I think. I mean, on this frame of kind of peace modalities are always changing, right? Peace modalities are constantly changing, and I think the thing, and I've been reading more about this and trying to understand it myself, the way in which we talk about nonviolence is kind of in some ways stuck in the past. It's some ways stuck in a 1960s civil rights kind of an approach to nonviolence. And I think that we're seeing shifts in the way that people contend against the state. Part of that has to do with neoliberalism and the fact that neoliberal capital markets have kind of created So I study marginalized people. I started off studying Dalits in India, a population of people who have been marginalized for thousands of years. That marginalization thousands of years ago doesn't look anything like it does today, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still marginalization. And I think that neoliberalism has kind of created this idea of open markets, this idea of kind of the increasing gap between rich and poor that we see all over the world, not just in the United States, I think has created a real power imbalance and allowed the powerful to really have kind of a monopoly of the instruments of war, a monopoly of the instruments of power, which become the police in the context of a Charlottesville. And it becomes very difficult for activists and others who are trying to change the system to approach what we traditionally think of as a nonviolent approach to social change. They're stomped down, right? And it's not to say that nonviolence is not necessary. I'm a strong believer in nonviolence. I was groomed and brought up in a family of parents who marched with Martin Luther King Jr., went to Selma and marched with King, and went to the March on Washington and things like that, right? And so I grew up with that awareness of kind of 1960s social movement. I think that social movement has shifted some, and I think that's partly due to the power structures and power relations within society, and particularly neoliberal globalization and how it's developed a very uneven kind of degree of power between the marginalized and the oppressor. And how do we break that? I by no means am advocating that violence is necessary, and I think there's a real tension within kind of social justice campaigns of the 2017s, of today, that social justice campaigns are really struggling to figure out how do we maintain a nonviolent stance while at the same time actually effectively trying to change a very unjust system. And how do you deal with the kind of frustration, aggression that arises from that kind of imbalance, right? That there are very many very frustrated people in the world, both on all sides, as Donald Trump would call it, right? Very much, white nationalists who are feeling as if they're now the minority, right? And feeling very much at odds. And as well as people who are marginalized, feeling as if nothing necessarily new. They've been marginalized for a long time, but the desire to see some change finally come, right, from that marginalization has led to frustration and can oftentimes lead to aggression. And I by no means think that aggression or violence is the way to make change. I think violence actually creates a legacy which leaves traumatic impacts for future generations and perpetuates cycles of violence, which is, the work I've been doing around trauma, resilience, and awareness has really taught me that, and I've seen that in lots of different communities. So I think the question is how do kind of marginalized communities, folks who are on the bottoms of society, how are they able to use their voice to actually create change, but do it in a way that doesn't perpetuate further violence? And this is difficult in a very uneven system and a very unbalanced power dynamic.
Okay, let's shift gears. We said we were going from the global to local. So let's go back to the global and talk about the trip that you have planned to go to Sicum, India, and what you hope your students will get out of that. Okay,
so the global is the local for me. I mean, that these systems of power are operating across the globe. So whereas the context in the U.S. is quite different in some ways than the context in Sicum, India, in other ways, it's really not quite different at all. And so this summer, summer of 2018, I'm planning to take, along with some colleagues from Guilford College, a group of students, undergraduate and graduate students. So it's a 598 course here at UNCG, which is a course that can take undergraduate and graduate students to go and look at Sicum, India, and to travel to Sicum, India. So Sikkim is an autonomous region of India. You actually have to cross a separate border within India to get to Sikkim, and it's a state that's had lots of internal conflict, and kind of conflict that I would say is not necessarily manifest today, but latent. And so this latent conflict over kind of a colonial annexation of Sicum, India in 1975 has created a legacy of not only refugees, but a legacy of frustration, and a legacy of actually Sikkim is one of the more affluent states of India, and there's some interesting reasons why that is based on this kind of history. And so we'll be looking at the history, the experience of the people from Sikkim, and the different ethnic groups that make up what is currently the Indian state of Sikkim. And we'll be learning about their culture, learning a little of their language, going and seeing how they live in the north of the country, which I'm really excited about because I've been to Gantok, which is the capital of Sikkim, but I've never actually gone up north, and I know that my colleague Heather Hayton, who I'll be going with on this trip from Guilford College, always takes students up to the north of the country and gets a kind of more rural feel to the state as well. And so we'll get a chance to really kind of tour the full state and get a sense of what life is like in the Himalaya region of India. Very mountainous region, very different mountain peoples and different culture. They're traditionally Buddhist, but being a state of India, there's been a big influx of Hindu thought and Hindu ideas. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see how those things integrate together and understanding. For me, it's always about kind of understanding how marginalized populations operate in kind of contexts in which they have little power and little voice. And so even though I may not frame that trip in that way for students, or as we go through customs, I certainly won't frame it in that way, but I would frame it very much as learning about the history and culture of a diverse Himalayan population.
If a student wants to get involved with this trip to Sikkim, what do they need to do?
Currently, it's up on the International Program Center's website. It's listed as a course, so they can go in, apply through the course, the online application, and then once they're accepted, they would register into HHS 589D, which is the course code.
And like Professor Rinker said, you can go to the International Program Center website, uncg.edu, and in the search engine, type in International Program Center. So, Professor Rinker?
Just correction, June 30th to August 1.
June 30th to August 1. So, Professor Rinker, we're getting ready to land. And before you leave, what is it that you would have your students know about peace and conflict studies? What is the main takeaway that you would have them take away from your classes?
It's a broad question because there's a lot of things we teach through peace and conflict studies. I don't want to leave with the sense that inner peace is outer peace, right? I was at a conference this last week, and there was a couple of workshops I went to that I quite frankly felt were kind of undercutting the science and power of research and knowledge that's been created in the field of peace and conflict studies. They were talking about inner peace and talking very kind of superficially, let's say, about this idea of inner peace. And I by no means want people to think of peace as some kind of a floaty-goaty idea, right? I want them to think of it as a concrete possibility, an ideal that we can work to, maybe never ultimately achieve, but that we're constantly working towards. Yes. And so I guess the main takeaway from most of my classes, I would say, or the main thing I would say that I want students to come out of the Peace and Conflict Studies program with is a sense that that we're all peacemakers, that we're all peace builders, and that we have to practice those skills. We have to learn how to do analysis. We have to think about theories. We have to think critically in order to be effective peace builders. Yes. And that if students can leave the Peace and Conflict Studies program with an ability to think critically and apply the knowledge that they learn, then they can be kind of peace entrepreneurs, right? And that we can as a collective culture rise to a greater level of peace if everyone is doing their small part to kind of be an entrepreneur towards creating effective and constructive social change.
That we all really truly are interconnected, and that the peace builders, politicians, medical folk, that religious folk, that we're all interconnected, and we have to make this work together.
You know, the interconnected, of course, to me resonates because of the Buddhist language of interconnected, right? But I would even frame it as kind of we all have a shared fate, and nothing is more clear in that regard than looking at kind of current discourse around North Korea, right? We see how closely tied our fate is when our leaders are using discourse that's really not very critical and not very thoughtful, with the potential of really causing World War III. I think we need to, in this day and age, be very, very careful to understand that we all have some narrative agency, that we all have ability to have voice, and how do we find ways to give that voice and to empower that voice are really critical things in this day and age. And I think that the science of peace and conflict studies, and I do say the science because I think there is a lot of hard, empirical, qualitative and quantitative research that shows the science of peace is developing a means, a model, a path to be able to think of ways in which this idea of peace can be achieved. And so being attentive to discourse, being attentive to the narratives we tell is a big part of what I personally am invested in trying to work on with activists, but also with those who are in the seats of power.
Jeremy, I want to say thank you very much for coming on today and sharing your views. And I hope that you reach more people who would be interested in coming in to learn more about peace and conflict studies through your undergrad course, Foundations in Peace and Conflict. And I'd like to close out with saying that there's power in the word, as the elders used to say, and words have power. And that relates back to John Paul Lederach and his theory on storytelling, narrative, and his sacred circle. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to being with you again next Thursday from 3 to 5. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Ta